Hello? Are you doing anything right now? Come and make some rings with us. Jesus, that's enough. Just having these two is sufficient. And you can have a lot of fun with them, or even exercise on them. I had such rings when I was a child. I still have them to this day. But they were probably made, I assume, from some bent beechwood. And they have already experienced the best part. They are on beautiful hemp ropes with a simple mechanism that allows for height adjustment. However, making such rings is quite an art. And you may have noticed that today these rings are commonly made from plywood. The current ones typically have an outer diameter of around 240 millimeters and a thickness, or diameter, since it is a circular cross-section, of 28 or 32 millimeters. While my old ones, the children's ones, had an average diameter of 180 millimeters and a thickness of about 20 millimeters. I decided to make a compromise, not only because it will be used by both children and adults, but also due to my machinery, and I will explain to you right away why. To make such rings, you will basically need a router and two bits. One, from which you will cut the rings, and the other, a radius hollow, which you will use to create this rounding. You can buy such rings today for 800 CZK, and for the same amount of money, you can purchase a set of radius router bits at uni-max. So I naturally preferred to buy the milling machines, because with those milling machines I can make the rings, while I can't make the milling machines with the rings. And in that set there's the largest milling cutter with a radius of 12.7 millimeters, which is half an inch. So ideally, I should have material that is 1 inch thick, which is 25.4 millimeters. I don't have such materials, so I actually had to make it from a semi-finished product, specifically from 18 millimeters thick plywood. I glued 2 pieces of plywood together, resulting in a board with a thickness of 36 millimeters, and I needed to remove the excess material. You can mill that off in a planer, but you will lose quite a bit of material, which I think is a shame. So I decided to cut it with a bandsaw, resulting in one thicker board that I will use for the rings and another thinner one that I can use for something else later. And here is the first limitation. I have a bandsaw that can cut approximately 210 millimeters, so I decided to make the ring with a diameter of 200 millimeters. It wasn't a joke. You need a blade with a low TPI, 3 teeth per inch, to effectively throw off the chips. In the end, I cut it from 2 sides, so I flipped it over and finished cutting it from the other side, and the result is fine. And then I went to run it through the thickness planer, or the planer. If you don't have it, you would have to sand it down, for example, with a belt sander. So it would probably be better to really get plywood of the appropriate thickness, whether it's 24 millimeters or even 28 millimeters. However, it would be better if you had a radius cutter with a radius of 14 millimeters. So I already have the board finished. I drew circles on it, and I found out that the addition is so small that if I were to mill it, I would end up cutting into the other piece as well. So I will cut it again on the bandsaw, which has a small kerf, and then I will cut each circle out separately. I will be cutting using a spiral cutter with a diameter of 6 millimeters and with such a very simple fixture. And first, of course, we will cut the outer diameter, because if we cut the inner one, we would lose the center that we need for placing the fixture using a brad. We can cut the outer diameter all the way through, but I recommend not cutting the inner diameter completely through. If you were to cut it all the way and didn't have the individual parts fixed relative to each other, it could kick back, and you could damage either the workpiece or, in certain cases, break the milling cutter, which would be a real shame. So I don't cut all the way through, just to a depth of about half or 2/3, and what remains. I then cut through using a jigsaw, and the excess that remains, I will trim using a bearing router. It is a bit more complicated technology, but it is also more reliable, so we have both rings finished in their raw state. Now we need to round them off, and because I want the edge to be of the highest quality, I could prefer to finish them a bit more on the lathe. And on the lathe, I first took it as it was, and then I smoothed it with sandpaper to make the surface as perfect as possible and to ensure that any irregularities wouldn't be copied during the rounding process. Radius routers have a bearing that you can use in this case when creating the rounding, but only from one side. Because if you create that rounding and turn the ring, then from the other side, the bearing basically cannot rest against the original edge, which is no longer there, but it would rest against the radius, allowing you to mill a bit deeper into the material than when it was originally turned. So at this moment, you cannot use the bearing. You need to make a simple corner stop that you will set up so that the ring does not go into the milling machine more than you need. Basically, it's better to make this stop right from the start and not use that bearing at all. It also has the advantage that it doesn't replicate the small irregularities that may remain after the previous milling. So, we have both rings milled and nicely rounded. They still need to be sanded. So for that purpose, I made narrow strips. First, I cut them from a used belt from a belt sander. And soon I realized that I hadn't done it right because if you have a higher quality belt sander, there is a graphite insert under the belt. And that graphite will really dirty the belt from the cut side. So I had dirty hands from that, which wouldn't have bothered me on its own. But as I went to the sanded ring, I got it dirty. So in the end, I took a new belt with a grit of 120 and cut strips from it again. This time, I cut it into thirds. It is a strip 100 millimeters wide, so I ended up with approximately 3 centimeter strips. Be careful not to sand radially, because you will create grooves and scratches on the inner diameter that are difficult to remove later. Therefore, it is necessary to keep it as angled as possible and to make a rocking motion while pulling it through. Then it will look really nice. This is for the surface finish. Those who know me probably have an idea. Yes, linseed oil. I always pour it from the larger packaging into something smaller, specifically into a glass bowl, and I heat it from below using a tea light. You will reach a temperature of almost 80 degrees, which is quite enough for that varnish. 60 degrees is sufficient to reduce the viscosity, allowing the varnish to better soak into the material. I used my circular turntable for that so it would be beautifully and evenly distributed all around. Let the paint soak in. What doesn't soak in will need to be wiped off after some time. And after the varnish has dried, you can try out the rings. You will need 2 straps. I use straps that can hold 1.5 tons, which is really sufficient. If only children will be swinging on it, then it obviously doesn't need to be 5-ton straps. However, if adults will be exercising on it and doing some tricks and hanging upside down, I would of course design it to be sufficiently strong. You can find a link to the milling machine used in the description below the video. And if you make such rings, I wish you a lot of fun with them. Thank you for watching, take care, and do something.